The history of our proud nation begins as all great tales do, in the midst of war. During the War for Southern Independence, in September 1862, the venerable and esteemed General Robert E. Lee brought the Army of Northern Virginia north into Maryland, drawing the Army of the Potomac under George McClellan into a fight near the town of Sharpsburg. There, along the banks of Antietam Creek, in the fields of corn ready for harvest, and around a solemn clapboard church, a maelstrom was unleashed upon the unsuspecting countryside. While the men from the north fought bravely, McClellan displayed his usual hesitancy in committing men to the battle. General Robert E. Lee seized upon McClellan's delay and indecision and brought up all of his reserves to push the Union soldiers off the field of battle. The loss at Sharpsburg, Maryland caused mass panic throughout the state and Washington, D.C. The U.S. government fled their capital, making haste for the town of York in Pennsylvania. The citizens of Maryland who had turned their backs on the Confederacy were then set upon by General J.E.B. Stuart and his cavalry. Less than a month later, President Abraham Lincoln received word from Don Carlos Buell of disaster out west. The Army of the Ohio had been defeated by General Braxton Bragg and his Army of the Mississippi. Buell was looking to recoup his losses, but informed the government in York he was continually falling back and could no longer exercise control over his army or the state of Kentucky. With two decisive defeats in as many months, emissaries from the French and British empires came to York to inform Lincoln of their government's recognition of the Confederate States as a sovereign nation. In early November, some northern morale was regained when General Ambrose Burnside was at the head of a small army which marched into Washington, D.C. unmolested. A week later, the government returned to the seat of their power. After losing the House of Representatives to the Democrats in the elections, the Republican Party was dealt another blow when a draft proclamation penned by President Lincoln made its way into northern newspapers. The draft proclamation gave voice to the abolitionists and declared all slaves in the southern states free. The outcome of the fall military campaigns, combined with the November election outcome, fostered a growing mood of anger and resentment against the U.S. government. Seeing no recourse, Lincoln finally bowed to public and political pressure from the Democrats and offered an armistice to discuss peace on the basis of Southern independence. The new year brought with it the hopes of permanent independence for the Confederacy. President Lincoln and President Jefferson Davis met at Hampton Roads, Virginia, along with ambassadors from France and Great Britain, to sign the Hampton Roads Treaty on January 1, 1863. The treaty granted the independence of the Confederate States of America. Borders were set at major rivers, and disputed states were granted to whichever military exercised control. Thus, Kentucky was ceded to the Confederacy, while Missouri, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. remained with the United States of America. Jefferson Davis also renounced all Confederate claims to unsettled western lands from Kansas to California in exchange for the recently settled Arizona Territory. The Indian Territory north of Texas was reorganized as the 5 civilized tribes and became a protectorate of the Confederacy. King Cotton had reigned in Dixieland since before the War for Southern Independence. Yet, by the start of the 1880s, the cotton-based economy of many southern states had become a dragnet. Cotton plantations were recording reduced crop outputs, and families were moving to the cities. President James Longstreet and congressional leaders recognized the need for economic change and allocated a large portion of the national budget in late 1880 towards buying English manufacturing equipment. Longstreet was also able to cajole and compromise with enough state governors to abolish slavery within the Confederacy at this time. The celerity with which the South industrialized was noted north of the Mason-Dixon by Harper's Weekly, which ran an expose on the economical changes occurring in the Confederacy. "1898 started and ended with war for the Confederate States. While docked at port in Havana, Cuba, the CSS Arkansas suddenly exploded and sank. The CS Navy and the Executive Mansion in Richmond immediately demanded answers from the Spanish, laying the blame of the incident solely on Spain's shoulders and their failure to curb the, quote, rebellious and savage nature of the Cuban people. With international efforts failing to divert a crisis, the CS Congress declared war on Spain in late April 1898. The Hispano-Confederate War had begun. While some naval action took place with ships such as the CSS Richmond seeing live combat, the majority of fighting took place in Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Confederate Army and Navy operated with little real resistance, and a peace was struck with the Spanish on August 25, 1898. The aftermath saw the Confederate States awarded Puerto Rico and a puppet government take over in Cuba. Recognizing their dire financial situation after the war with the Confederacy, Spain approached both the Germans and Americans with an official diplomatic offer. The Treaty of Three was signed between Spain, Germany, and the United States of America in February 1899. For the sum of $20 million, the U.S. purchased Guam and the Philippines. Germany purchased the remaining Spanish Pacific Islands for 5 million marks. On February 14, 1912, Arizona became the 13th state in the Confederacy, with its capital in Phoenix. The state, stretching from Texas to the U.S. border of California from east to west, was the second largest Confederate state after Texas. It had the longest international border, with the U.S. both to the north and west, and Mexico bordering to the south. On August 23, 1914, the Confederate Congress declared war on the Central Powers, answering the call to arms issued by Great Britain. Yet, with the United States' warm relations with the German Empire, fears of a U.S. entry with the Central Powers kept most Confederate men in North America throughout much of the year. Finally, in the spring of 1915, the Confederacy sent General Frank Parker, a South Carolina native, and the 1st R.E. Lee Division to northern France to help with the English and Indian divisions entrenched around New Chapelle. While the English welcomed the boys in gray, General Parker soon made it clear his men would not fight next to or with the Indian divisions. Tensions dissipated when the English command acquiesced and placed the Confederates with the Highlander Division. Back at home, Virginian Woodrow Wilson had been elected as CS president. Months later, the Mexican bandito Pancho Villa raided eastern Arizona near Columbus. The small army garrison of the town engaged Villa's rebels in what became known as the Battle of Columbus. As a result of Villa's actions, Wilson proposed a punitive expedition into Mexico to pursue Villa and his compatriots. But his Secretary of War, General Mason Patrick, refused to act on the president's wishes. Anticipating a new front in the European War, the German government transmitted what would come to be known as the Zimmermann telegram to Mexican officials. British intelligence intercepted the message, which offered the prospect of winning back Arizona and Texas for the Mexicans in exchange for an alliance with the German Empire. The telegram caused the Confederate-Mexican border to become even more heavily militarized by both nations. In August 1918, as war raged in Europe, a Mexican national suspected of gun smuggling was chased from the Arizonan side of Ambos Nogales to the Sonoran side of the town by a CS customs agent and 2 Confederate soldiers. A Mexican soldier at the border reacted to the perceived invasion by firing at the Confederates, killing one of the soldiers. Return fire killed the Mexican soldier, and the situation quickly grew out of hand. Reinforcements were brought in on both sides, with both the 1st CS Cavalry and the 3rd Texas Rangers deployed to the border town. Eventually, the Confederate Army organized an assault over the border and took the opposing hilltop positions of the Mexican Army. In the aftermath of the Second Battle of Ambos Nogales, 7 Confederates lay dead, while reports of as little as 30 to as many as 129 Mexicans were killed. Most surprisingly, 2 German military attachés died during the assault. The news of German military advisors sent the government in Richmond and all of Dixie into a fury. President Wilson immediately ordered the planned punitive expedition, and Confederate forces occupied Hermosillo, the capital of Sonora, in retaliation. By the end of September 1918, the Confederates claimed Sonora as their own. 2 months later, the Great War ended with an Allied victory. On October 29, 1929, the United States stock market crashed, and subsequently, the Bank of the United States faced a run on its deposits. On October 30, 1929, the Confederate States stock market faced a similar crash in stock prices. Before the end of the day, the Bank of North Carolina faced deposit runs, which spread like wildfire from Dixieland's financial hub. To complicate financial matters, a boll weevil pestilence had spread quickly from Sonora to Texas and then into the rest of the Gulf states, devastating cotton production. Many families in the Confederacy, both white and black, faced ever-growing unemployment for the next several years. In 1933, Harry Flood Byrd, the governor of Virginia, was elected CS president. Byrd won on his friendly demeanor and policies of the New South, which would help the Confederacy out of their economic malaise. Soon Byrd had both an ally and a potential opponent when Louisiana Governor Huey Long burst onto the national political scene. Governor Long preached the gospel of the New South programs Byrd hoped to enact, yet his fiery rhetoric and supposedly shady backroom dealings spoke disaster for Byrd's even-handed Virginia politics if Long decided to take his every man a king populist act to Richmond in 1937. Yet all of the Deep South's hopes were dashed when Carl Weiss, an anti-Long activist, shot and killed the governor in the Louisiana Capitol building after Long had successfully ousted Weiss's father-in-law, who was a state judge. By 1936, the policies enacted 2 years earlier have only begun to show their effects. But the CSA had not yet lifted itself out of the economic hole that many blamed on their cousins to the north.